I'm Tim Ventura, and we're joined today by Lieutenant General David Deptula, retired, the Dean of the Mitchell Institute of Aerospace Power Studies. General Deptula is the world-recognized leader and pioneer in conceptualizing, planning, and executing national security operations from humanitarian relief to major combat. He transitioned from the U.S. Air Force in 2010 at the rank of Lieutenant General after more than 34 years of service. He joins us today to discuss the risks and opportunities of air power in today's rapidly changing world. So David, welcome. And let me start by thanking you for your career of incredible service. And I'd like to also ask what the core values of integrity first, service before self, and excellence in all we do mean to you personally and professionally.
Well, first, thanks very much for taking the time to chat with me today. I very much appreciate the kind introduction. And to jump right into answering your questions, I think we're very fortunate in the Department of the Air Force as we've been given these three overarching tenets that stand as a great guide to character and leadership. Now, first off, with respect to integrity, as an airman or now as a guardian in the Space Force, you have to be a person of integrity, courage, and conviction. People today who are members of the service have got to be willing to control their impulses and exercise courage, honesty, and accountability in order to do what's right. And as many people have said over the years, to do what's right, even when no one else is around or watching what their selections are. Now, service before self, to me, means that the military professional's duties take precedence over personal desires. Every airman or guardian is expected to have the discipline to follow rules, exhibit self-control, and possess respect for the beliefs, authority, and work of others. And then finally, regarding excellence, what it means is that airmen and guardians strive for continued improvement in self and service in order to advance the capabilities of the Air Force and the Space Force, as well as to achieve greater accomplishment and performance for themselves, as well as the community and the country, ultimately. And well, I tell you, well before these tenets were introduced, my guide to life was a quote from Thomas Jefferson that was passed on to me by my father. And it essentially said, seek the path of honor, the light of truth, and the will to work for mankind. So that's another way of looking at these tenets, but they're certainly applicable as we move forward in any stage of life. So a bit long there, but I hope that answers your question.
Oh, no, that's wonderful. Well, and so in terms of service, and I was trying to think of a contemporary issue that this might apply to as well. I mean, your extensive career includes being the principal attack planner for Operation Desert Storm, the commander of the no-fly zone operations over Iraq in the late 90s, and the director of the air campaign over Afghanistan in 2001, among many other honors and accomplishments. So given your strategy in desert operations, I'm wondering what your thoughts are as the DoD begins to change its focus from this desert-oriented operation strategy to the South Pacific and China theater.
Well, it's an interesting question. I would tell you that, you know, that the environment certainly has an impact, but is not the determining factor. Fundamental to the success in Desert Storm was an approach that we took that focuses on the outcomes that we wanted to accomplish. It's become known over the years as effects-based operations, or an effects-based approach to operations, where you look at what is the challenge, but just sort of begin at the end. What is the outcome of the engagement, whether it be with lethal or non-lethal force, whether it's a military action, whether it's something that involves the economy, information, or diplomacy. and that's where you need to start. So whether we're talking about operations in the South Pacific, in Asia, or in Eastern Europe, you need to start with the end game in mind. And so in that regard, I think the approaches that we take are the same. Ways and means will differ given environmental factors. Clearly in Asia, we're talking about large distances. You know, it's 1,500 miles or so from Guam to the coast of China. The first island chain is a little bit closer, but then there are factors there in terms of operating with allies. And our allied partners become even more important, perhaps, than they were when we garnered the dozens and dozens that we did for Operation Desert Storm, which, by the way, just a little factoid for your audience. I know you're not going to run this live, but today is the 31st anniversary of the first full 24 hours of operations of Operation Desert Storm. So a couple of thoughts to consider for you.
So you actually mentioned Eastern Europe a moment ago, and that was my next question, because it looks like there's some signaling going on, right? In the South Pacific, it seems like there's some signaling. And then Russia appears to be currently massing troops near Ukraine, which may prompt us to respond with a buildup of our own. Do you see that as a possibility? Or?
Well, Tim, what I tell you is you got to go back to first principles. You know, when you say us massing troops as a buildup of our own, if you mean us, the United States alone, no, I don't see us, the United States, building up forces on her own. That area of the world and the entire reason for the stand-up of the North Atlantic Treaty Alliance was to counter, at the time, the aggression or potential aggression of the Soviet Union, and NATO still exists. So this is an issue that NATO needs to identify and to deal with, of which the United States is the biggest member country. Got it, particularly with respect to the military. But Ukraine is not a NATO member. That's part of the issue here. Russia doesn't ever want Ukraine to be part of NATO. NATO's position is that, well, whether it is or not, is not a foregone conclusion, but the decision whether or not to apply for membership rests with the sovereign country of Ukraine. So this is creating a fissure that is going to have to be dealt with, but I don't see buildups of U.S. troops or putting U.S. troops in harm's way as an option on the part of the United States by its own. Again, NATO might take some moves in terms of building up NATO forces in the region, but once again, we have to balance the outcome relative to the ways and means in order to achieve that outcome. So we can't take force off the table, but I frankly don't see the United States taking actions on its own in this regard.
Absolutely. Well, the reason I asked about China and Russia back to back is because I'm wondering if, again, this transition from desert operations to what could be a two-pronged peacekeeping, buildup, I guess, as part of NATO, and then also in the South Pacific, on opposite sides of the globe, involving, as you mentioned, the massive distances. Does that have the possibility to spread our resources thin? Do you think that's a possible concern, or is that not an issue?
No, it's absolutely a concern. As I think you've heard me say before, we're facing a significant strategy resource match here in the United States with respect to U.S. National security interests. And there is the fundamental basis of our national security strategy is twofold. Regardless, and has been for about the last 30, 40, 50 years, And it essentially, regardless of administration, regardless of what political party has been in power, and it essentially is this, that the United States will retain sufficient number of forces in engagement around the world in order to shape the environment to promote peace and stability. Well, in order to do that, you have to have sufficient resources to maintain a rotational base, to provide that presence, to achieve those goals of peace and stability. The second enduring tenet is that we need to have sufficient forces to be able to fight and win in more than one major regional contingency at a time. Because if you only plan for a single sufficient forces and capability to do a single major regional contingency, that encourages adversaries elsewhere to achieve or to engage in aggression. So we're at a point in time today where we have let our force structure and our military atrophy. We've been consumed with low-level, low-end conflict over the last 20 years in terms of counterinsurgency and counterterrorism fights in the Middle East. And quite frankly and honestly, we let the rest of our forces atrophy, and we've got to change that. And there is a danger of multiple contingencies rising up in the United States not having the capability to respond effectively.
Well, do you see any solutions that might help align these needs and goals with the required resources? I mean, especially in light of these changing strategic concerns.
Well, let me just reiterate again, a couple of years ago, the National Defense Strategy Commission explained today's circumstances when it concluded that America is very near the point of strategic insolvency, where its means are badly out of alignment with its ends. And so I'd tell you that given the looming threats that are posed by nations like China and Russia, North Korea, and Iran, the danger is very real. I've thought about this, and I would tell you we've got 4 plausible alternatives for resolving this discrepancy. One is to increase the defense budget, but guess what? That's not likely to happen in today's environment. 2, the other obvious choice is to lower the expectations of the defense strategy. All right, if you don't want to spend the money to address the issues and to fulfill the demands of our defense strategy, then change it, reduce it. But guess what? That's also not likely to happen. Third, we can accept the growing strategy resource mismatch, which is potentially disastrous. This essentially is the route that we've been going down for the last 30 years. We've told people that, oh yeah, we can do this, when in fact we really can't. And then fourth, we can start evaluating our defense capabilities in terms of the desired effects that they contribute to meeting the needs of our strategy. Now, again, let me summarize. Options 1 and 2 are pragmatically and politically unrealistic. We're not going to increase the defense budget to the degree that it needs to be. And 2, we're not going to change our defense strategy expectations. Option 3 is what we've been doing the past 2 decades. And that's saying we can do what we can do, but in fact, we really can't. And that's becoming untenable in the face of growing military capabilities of Russia and China. And option 4 is to start making prudent decisions inside the Department of Defense on what gives us the most capability for our investment. It's going to be difficult, but it's entirely feasible. We just need the defense leadership that's willing to make some hard choices.
Well, thank you. Now, another resource concern, and this is something that's come up in previous interviews that I've done, is our technology supply chain. And I think this applies largely to civilian, right? Because a lot of military stuff is manufactured, you know, with this in mind. But given the DoD's increased reliance on technology in general in the modern battle space, do you have concerns about supply chain disruption for key components if an escalation occurs with China?
Absolutely. I mean, you know, the sexy stuff that people like to talk about in terms of defense, you know, are the military forces, the ships, the planes, the soldiers on the ground, and the sailors. But guess what? None of it works without the supply chain that you're talking about and the logistics component. All our logistics plans in the Pacific are in the open. They're not even on classified networks. So where do you think the first attacks are going to come? They're going to come in disrupting the information flow that we all so much rely upon. And to make matters worse, the Department of Defense over the last several decades has gotten this enamored with business models and just-in-time delivery. Well, that works for the commercial world, but it's nonsense for military operations, when what we need to be doing is stockpiling equipment, munitions, capability all over the world so that we can get it when we need it. Not modeling a business model that has commercial business model that makes absolutely zero sense for defense. So we need to change our perspective and remember that warfare is the most ineffective, inefficient, and horrible thing that mankind's ever devised. But if you're going to win it, you have to deal with it in a fashion that allows one to win, not achieve some sort of profit motive business case model that is guaranteed to fail. So the fewer businessmen and women that we have in the Department of Defense, quite frankly, the better off we'll be, because they haven't done a very good job over the last 20 years.
Yeah. Well, I'd also like to touch briefly on the creation of the U.S. Space Force. And I'm wondering if, were you in favor of the creation of this branch? And does separating out those space assets help alleviate some of these resource allocation concerns that you've talked about?
Well, it's an interesting question, but whether or not I was in favor of the creation of the Space Force is kind of a moot point because we have one. So my perspective today is I want to make sure that we articulate all the elements of what we need to do to set the Space Force up for success. And it's a real challenge. Space is enormously important. It's fundamental to our way of war. And that was part of the rationale for standing it up, quite frankly, is, you know, we need to garner as much attention on space as we do in the other domains. And that's an appropriate call. Now the issue becomes, does the Space Force have sufficient funds? Does it have sufficient manpower? And does it have the authorities necessary to integrate the numerous and disparate organizations and agencies with a role in space into the Space Force to mandate its providing trained and ready Space Forces to combatant commanders? And the answer to all three of those questions is no. It doesn't have sufficient funds. It doesn't have sufficient manpower. And there are over 60 organizations with authorities in space that the Vice President of the United States, in the buildup to the Space Force, and the logic was, hey, we're going to stand up a Space Force and we're going to integrate all of these elements so that at least everyone that has a hand in space is operating with the same guidance and direction. You know how much integration has occurred of those organizations in the last 2 years? Zero. None of the organizations external to the Space Force that have a hand in space have been integrated into the Space Force. I see that as a real problem, and we need to solve it. We need to solve it fast.
Yeah. Well, if it's okay, I'd like to switch gears a little bit and touch on technologies. And the reason is there's so much change. I mean, there's so many new innovations. Hypersonic weapons are a big one. They've been making a lot of headlines recently. And I'm wondering, do you think that the advent of things like hypersonic weapons foreshadow the beginning of a new arms race?
No, what I tell you is we've been in an arms race for the last 20 years, and we've been losing. We've been losing big time to the Chinese and the Russians. And so we're starting to wake up from the realization of that fact. And again, we were distracted by these small scale contingencies that, while they're important in the grand scheme of national security, we are looking back now and realizing that maybe we shouldn't have taken our eye off the ball of being prepared for major regional conflict. And hypersonics are part of that. So we're working hard to catch up in that realm, but we're behind.
Well, and one of the reasons that I asked about that was the advances in weapons like this, the increased performance in fighter aircraft, I mean, increased range of electronics, all of those things. I'm wondering, do you think that will drive a trend towards unmanned and autonomous vehicles? Because it seems like the machines are reaching the point of outperforming the humans that pilot them.
Well, it's a wonderful question. The short answer is yes. We're going to see a move toward more uninhabited vehicle and autonomous vehicle elements as part of our military. That doesn't mean that the human being is going to go away. There will always be humans either in the loop or on the loop, making the fundamental decisions on what these systems might do. But what we're going to do is we are going to capitalize on artificial intelligence and machine-to-machine learning in a fashion to supplement and help humans perform the activities that get to the end game of those desired effects that I talked about earlier. So you're going to see a lot more of what's become known as manned-unmanned teaming, where you would have a series of autonomous aircraft, for example. Let's take the aviation realm. And this applies to sea and land as well. But I'm more familiar with the air piece, and people are doing a lot more work with the air piece, where you have a one aircraft, let's say an F-35 out there, that has essentially control over half a dozen to a dozen other aircraft that are operating in conjunction with that manned aircraft, but they're operating in an autonomous fashion. Now, that doesn't mean that they necessarily are going to be making weapons engagement decisions on their own. But given the authority and authorization of the human in a particular circumstance, may launch weapons and do it in a fashion that facilitates outperforming, outthinking, and acting quicker than an adversary. So yeah, we're going to see more and more and more of that.
Yeah, and actually, you just touched on one of my next questions, because that was a kind of one of the next generation UAV concepts that I'd read about was something called predator drone swarms, which is exactly what you're talking about. You would have perhaps a single predator that's piloted remotely, and a human is making the decisions about engagement and things like that. And then other predator drones would be essentially controlled by that unit, I guess. So,
well, predators, just to be specific here, predators have all been retired. Those were the MQ-1s. We now have Reapers out there, and there'll be a variety of other drones, UAVs, RPAs, whatever you'd like to call them. We're probably, I'm the one that came up with the use of the terminology remotely piloted aircraft in the mid first decade of the 2000s, because too many people were associating autonomy with the drones that we had. And in fact, they weren't. They were actually remotely piloted aircraft. And so when people understood that and went, oh, okay. But now when we move toward greater autonomy, when you get into talking about swarms, there needs to be autonomous control, because the decisions that need to be made to keep a swarm acting all in cognizance with the individual elements is simply too fast and too much for a single human being to accomplish. So therefore, that level of autonomy will be transferred over to them. What the swarm does and in what it uses to accomplish that will be a decision made by a human being. So yeah, the swarm technology is alive and well and continuing to develop.
Well, now another area for automation, and it seems like this might be, I guess, a lower bar to achievement, is like logistical and support functions, right? So I'm wondering, is the DoD started looking seriously at unmanned systems for refueling, resupply, cargo transport, things along those lines? Those are, I mean, they're pretty simple and monotonous tasks, right? So it would be freeing up air crews to focus on things that matter, I guess.
Well, refueling matters, particularly if you're a
Well,
pilot
yeah.
flying an airplane and you're running out of gas. I've been there, done that. But yes, what you're talking about is maybe that don't matter, because all these things matter, but routine operations that you don't necessarily need, that technology is allowing other options than having a human control. A great example is intelligence, reconnaissance, and surveillance. Project Maven that was in the news. We used to have all of these human beings as analysts sitting there watching video off of drones, waiting for something to happen. Well, you don't need a human being to do that. It's very easy to program a computer to be watching a scene. And if you have change in the light pixels, then you notify someone who then comes over to take a look at it. That is very mundane, but it's extraordinarily important. So we're doing that today. The Navy is building an uninhabited air refueling tanker right now today that they can use off of an aircraft carrier, the MQ-25. So yeah, you're going to see more and more examples of activities that can be performed by autonomous or remotely operated systems come more and more into the forefront of operations and integration into the military.
Yeah, well, and let me apologize for my choice of words. Matter is probably not the best one. I actually, that's not even what I wrote, but it just seems simpler to say.
Yeah, no,
but,
yeah, I understand.
Yeah, well, so I guess one of the final things I wanted to ask about was you've recommended that the Air Force Academy make Air Force history a core curriculum requirement, which makes complete sense. I'm wondering, could you tell me a little bit about that goal? And do you see challenges integrating those historical lessons in today's rapidly changing and highly technological environment?
Well, it's a wonderful question, and I appreciate you asking it. I would tell you that, over my 4 decades in the military, and as I get more and more senior, it is important to recognize that history is fundamental to success. And when it comes to the academies, it's not just U.S. history, but to an officer, one's selected services history, whether you're soldier, sailor, Air Force, Marine, Space, Guardian, whatever. Because only in that manner can one understand what's gone on before, what's worked and what hasn't. There's simply not enough time in one's career to personally accumulate the wisdom of those who have faced the same or similar challenges to the one that, or the ones that a new individual is going to have to deal with it. So that's why for the last 10 years, I've been trying to get the Air Force Academy to make Air Force history a core curriculum requirement. Now, to their credit, they're finally standing up a course in Air Force history, but it is an elective. I would tell you, history is fundamentally important, regardless of what discipline one's going to go into. And you've got to understand your service's history, because I'm here to tell you, from an Air Force perspective, the Army, the Navy, and the Marines, officers and enlisted folks understand theirs.
Wonderful. Well, David, let me close by thanking you once again for your service. And let me ask, what comes next for you personally and professionally?
Well, that's a great question. As you know, and you mentioned, I'm the Dean of the Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Studies. We are growing. in garnering greater influence, and I intend to continue to operate in this role to make the organization as stronger as possible. And at some point before I move on, good Lord willing, I'd like to write a book, not a there I was, but one that can basically contribute to what I just talked about. And that's to provide insights based on experiences that today's generation simply doesn't have. I mean, when you think about it, the last major regional conflict was Operation Desert Storm. That was 31 years ago. There are only a handful of people left on active duty, and I literally mean a handful of people left on active duty who participated in that conflict. All they've known growing up are small-scale contingencies. And that's not the kind of threat that we're facing with China or Russia. So I'd like to be able to contribute to the kind of thought process based on experience in reality. And so maybe one of these days I'll get around to being able to do that. But right now, running the Mitchell Institute consumes all of my time, or most, not all of my time, but most of my time. And I hope to find some time to write a book one of these days.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Well, David, thank you yet again, sir.
Take care. Have a great aerospace power kind of day.
Thanks.